Once you have put all of your rows together and your quilt top is now a completed quilt top, you should check before you put your borders on to see if anything needs trimmed on the outside. I'm going to use my table runner to show you how to do that. You remember, we know that these squares, the big squares, were cut 5.5. They've only been used in one seam, so that means that from this intersection to here should be 5.25. And the same is true for these. These were each cut 2 inches by 5.5, which means that should be 5.25. You can also check this and know that from here to here, these were cut 2 inches, only one seam, so that's 1.75 now. So we have a couple different reference points. 5.25 for this seam. We know that this straight seam here, it should be straight. This is our block, which would be 8.5 prior to sewing. So from the top to this seam is 8.25. What I'm going to do is line up the ruler on a horizontal line here. That looks really good. And because I know that this first seam is to be 5.25, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.25, I'm checking, and I'm going to continue on down to the next intersections and make sure that it's straight. If it's not, go ahead and trim here. You are going to do that on all 4 sides of your quilt. I prefer to do my 2 long sides first and then rotate the quilt and do the top and bottom, which were the short sides. It does not matter. It's just a habit that I have gotten into. So if I'm looking at the top and bottom of my table runner, I now know that because of this square here, remember it was cut 3.5, it's only in one seam, so from the edge to this intersection should be 3.25. And the same is true from here. Back here though, we're back to the 5.25. So I'm going to line up on a horizontal seam here. I'm going to check my vertical seam all the way. That horizontal seam is good. And all of these are good. And I would trim here. So you do that, and then we're going to add the borders. If you recall, I told you that what I do in the paper that I showed you explains this. I measure the quilt top through the center and record that. I then measure close to the edge, not right at the edge, but close to the edge, and then I take the average. I've done that. I know that my table runner is 32.5 inches long on the sides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the center of this side. I'm simply going to fold this in half, making sure that it is even. And for me, because this is only 8 blocks, it's right at this seam. I open that up. I'm going to put a pin at this seam. I'm going to get one I think that you could see. Should be right there. Now, we should have already sewn our borders together. In case you haven't, let me show you that. You're going to cut the strips that you need. Now, I know some of you are going to choose not to put borders. I still want you to see this so that you understand the process. If you are going to put borders, I believe you cut 6 border strips. You need to sew those together. And in the instructions, she has you sew them end to end so that it looks like this instead of on a diagonal. And the papers I gave you talked about the diagonal. but on this one, I want you to do what she includes in the instructions, and that's called a butted seam. We just put the two ends together like this, and you sew with your 1/4 inch. Now, if you want to, and again, reduce your stitch length. If you want to, you could just put a locking stitch or a back stitch the beginning and end to this, because this is going to be on the outside of the quilt and it's going to be manipulated a little bit. You don't have to. First thing you're going to do with your 6 strips, you are going to cut your selvages off. You need to make sure that you get all of that. It's easy to see here where the white is, but there are some little dots here in this yellow. You need to make sure those are taken out. You're going to sew your strips together, press that seam open. Now, as I said, we measured this quilt and it was 32.5 inches long. So what I did was I took that big long strip of border and I cut a strip that's 32.5 inches long for one side. Whoops. I cut another one that's 32.5 inches long because we have 2 sides to your quilt. What I then do is I fold this, oops, in half as well. And you can just put a little mark there. You can go ahead and put a pin there, whichever you want to do. I'll put a pin. I think you'll be able to see it a little bit better. Okay. So now we're going to open up this quilt where we know where the center is. Here. You are going to find in the center of your strip as well, and you're going to match those up. If you're using seam-aligned glue, you can do that, or you can pin. Now, I told you your borders are going to go on the bottom, but for me, it's easiest to start pinning with the border up on top. So instead of pinning like this, I'm going to pin so it's underneath. I then take the strip in the quilt and come all the way to the end. And I pin that as well. Then I go all the way to the other end. And I pin that as well. Now I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to pin in between these areas. Now, if your quilt was not square exactly, this edge might be a little difficult to match up. If that's the case, you do it as best you can, and then you will ease in everything in between the center and here. I'll show you what I mean by that. So now that I know, put my pin cushion on for you, that this is right, I'm going to see if there's anything that needs fixed here, if there's any bulk, and then I'm going to put pins in between. And now I'm going to be putting the pins. You can put as few or as many as you want. I tend to suggest to people, if you're not sure, go ahead and put one at every intersection, especially if you're worried that your seam allowance is going to get caught, then maybe in between in the big blocks. So that's what I'm going to do on this one. I'm going to keep coming down here. Make sure this is flat. Now, if you can, I hope you can see this. The background piece is a little bit bigger than the green. I would not have cut or not have left the background larger if it was not correct. So when you're lining these up, line up to where the background piece matches the border fabric. Now I have a seam here that is pressed to one direction because when I sewed my rows together, I sewed the top row one way, pressed it, or I sewed that and pressed it to the right, and then the bottom row I pressed to the left. We talked about this the last time, an extra pinning that I do because I'm going to be sewing in this direction to make sure, especially on a quilt, that this does not shift down here. I'm going to place a pin in here to hold that in place. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but normally when we pin, we simply pin and it's open like that. I did a little bit more of a weave in here. It's one, and then this goes in between the two layers. And that's simply to save my arm from getting pinched or stuck with that pin. Now what we're going to do with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew down this side, the whole side, and I press to the border once it's done. You can press open if you'd like to. I'm going to get this done, and then I'm going to show you the top and bottom. I have the side borders sewn on now, all the way down. And as I said, I have pressed those out to the border. If you would like to press open, like we did the blocks, you're welcome to do that. It does not matter either way. We're going to follow the same process for adding the top and bottom borders that we did for the side, which means we are going to measure approximately through the center of the quilt to see what this will be. And it should, I know what it should be, 19.5. I'm also going to measure close to the top and down near the bottom as well. Actually, I've already done that, and I know that they are all 19.5. So from the rest of that border strip that you made, that long border strip, you need to cut 2 strips that are 19.5. I'm going to show you something when you're doing that. Because we have the intersections here of where we had to piece the border strips, we want to be careful where that intersection falls. So if I'm going to cut this, I would actually be measuring it to cut it 19.5, which would be here, which means you've got this intersection very close to the edge of the quilt. And it would end up being right about there. That's too close for me. I don't like seeing that pieced intersection there. Because this border strip is simply a random design on it, what I'm going to do instead is move it, instead of coming from the end that I had already been cutting, I'm going to rotate and cut my 19.5 here. This piece will not have a seam. So it is okay to do that. If this was a directional print, if this had a specific design element that you needed to keep the direction, you couldn't do that. So you want to keep that in mind. We're going to do the same thing that we did with the side borders. We're going to find the center. Again, I know, because this is only 2 blocks this way, I know that this intersection here is the center. I already have 1 strip that's cut. I'm going to fold that. I'll do it so you can see. Fold that in half. Now the last time I placed a pin in there, I'm going to show you another thing that you can do. You can take the border strip that you have folded in half and just lay it on top at that point where they meet. Then you don't need to put a pin in that second or on the border strip. But you will do the same thing. Put the pin in the middle, and see how this one isn't quite perfect. It has to be manipulated a little bit. So I'm going to do that. Again, I pin so that the border is going to be on down on the bottom near the feed dogs. Now that I have that secured, I'm going to turn it over and pin the rest of the way here. And then I will simply sew and press this to the border, which is the way that I press the other one. Had I pressed the other one open, then I would be pressing that open as well, or this one open as well. So it doesn't really matter, as I said, which way you press. It's simply a personal preference. I will be sewing down this way, so I'm going to put a pin vertically along the bottom to secure this. I'm going to take this to the machine, I'm going to sew it, and there is one last thing that I want you to do after the borders are on. If you have multiple borders, I know a couple people are deciding on putting more than one border, you will follow the same procedure for every border that you add. Exactly the same. I'm going to sew this, I'll be right back and show you the one last step that I like to do for adding security to the quilt top. I have the top and bottom sewn on, which means my table runner is ready to be quilted. When you're at this point, it means your quilt is ready to be quilted. There is one last thing, as I said, that I like to do. Especially in this fabric that I have in the border, it's fraying a lot. And if you have chosen not to add a border, you have a lot of seams that are going to be right at the very end. What I like to do is to stitch 1/8 of an inch all the way around the quilt top. All the way around. And again, it's 1/8 of an inch. It's a little challenging to see that. I'm going to try to get up close to see if you can see that stitch. Right there. That stitch is going to stop this from fraying, and it's going to hold any of the seams closed. We are going to be manipulating this when we are layering this to get ready to, with our backing and batting, and get ready to quilt it. If you're going to have your quilt chosen to be long arm quilted, it's going to be stretched onto a machine and potentially can have some of these seams come loose or cause more fraying. This just takes a couple minutes to do, and I think it is well worth that time. It is, like I said, 1/8 of an inch. It just needs to be less than what your binding will be. This will be covered up in the binding. I'm going to look at the back of this. You can see that I did press the borders in both directions, toward the border rather, but you can press that open. Now I do have, oftentimes people ask, should they trim this down if, for instance, right here, the side is a little bit bigger than the top and bottom. I do not trim this because it should have been taken care of in here. If for some reason it's off, which it is here because I'm a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch on here, I'm not going to trim this now. I'm going to wait until it's quilted and make the correction then. If it was more than this, I would probably have to fix that, because then this wouldn't be square when I'm quilting it or after I quilt it. And this seam would veer and you would see that.